So when I do the pencil drawing for my paintings, I tend to do it pretty light, and if I get too dark, I'll actually start erasing some of the lines before I start painting. But generally I'm putting lines down so I can have a visual reference for myself when I'm painting, but I don't want the lines to be very prominent. So I will put down the pencil lines as I need to, and in order for me to really capture the perspective and make sure things are in the right place. But generally, after I get the underlying pencil drawing to a place where I want it to be, I'll go back in with my eraser and try to make sure there aren't any passages here that really stick out as being too dark and will be too prominent in the actual watercolor painting. I do that because I've found that when I have lines that are very dark and the drawing is very precise, that I lose a little bit of flexibility when I'm going in with the paint. It makes me feel like I have to stay within the lines and the boundaries, and while I do like being precise generally in my art, I don't want to feel too constricted when I'm working on the actual painting portion. It helps me to stay a little bit looser and helps me to use the paint to actually create the lines and the edges that I want. So I would rather use the paint to do that than to be beholden to any particular line that I've put down. So yeah, wherever there is like really sharp, high contrast areas that I've created because of the pencil, I'll actually go in and just erase it a little bit so I can lighten it up, and I want to make sure nothing really stands out as being too dark. Nothing that I can't like cover up with paint. And you know, for some things like the foliage, the bushes, I'll actually keep them very, very light because I just want to know the general shape of them before I actually paint. So that's how I deal with the underlying pencil drawing before I start the painting process. So here's a commissioned painting that I'm doing of a client's house, and I've gotten most of the house structure itself to a place where I'm pretty satisfied with it. I'm going to be filling in some of the structures on either side, the neighbors' houses, later, but I'm going to try to keep those a little bit out of focus and not be the main focus of this painting. What I want to do right now is show how I would approach dealing with the sky. In the picture that they provided, it's a clear blue sky, and actually for me what I like to do is turn this around and basically protect the central part of the painting by turning it upside down, and my desk, which is slanted towards me, will actually allow me to control the water, and I'll know that the water is always going to flow downwards towards me, and that way it won't ruin the house. So now my next task here is to wet the areas that I'm going to paint blue. I'm going to just kind of go around areas that I don't want to be painting wet on wet on. And obviously I'm doing this because it's going to be a wet on wet application. It's really the best way to get a nice even wash. And I'm going to just try to leave some sky holes, places where the sky is showing through. And I'm just trying to wet this enough to get some good coverage. And then I'm going to use my French ultramarine, and I'm going to be careful not to introduce more water to the wet paper, but rather just focus on introducing pigment. And it's okay if it's not exact, because all these places where the sky meets certain edges, like the trees, can actually just be very soft, and actually I can overlap with the penciled in outlines of the trees, because ultimately I'm going to be covering up those parts of the sky with the edges of the trees anyway. So it's not a huge deal if this isn't exact. Putting some sky holes in here. A tree is going to be here. I'm going to put more sky holes here. Again, it's a little tricky because I'm painting upside down. All right, so I think that's a good wash for the sky, and I'm going to let that sit and dry, so there's no chance of any of the color actually falling down. If I turn this over right side up, it might bleed onto the house, although it's probably not going to happen. But yeah, so that's how I would handle the sky in a scene where I've already painted most of the structures. Now I'm going to start filling in some of the trees, and this is basically painting around the rooftop, and I'm actually going over some of the blue that I put down, and that's okay because this is actually going to end up being a darker tone. I'm going to layer another darker green on top of this, and you can see how I'm covering some of the white space that I left there. And so right now I'm just putting on the lighter, more greenish tones of the tree, basically the areas that are more exposed to the sunlight. And you'll see that I left a bunch of white space here when I did the blue sky. And that's okay, because I'm going to cover that up, and there's just a way for me to leave some white space and be able to have a more pure green tone in there than if I actually covered all that area up with blue. Then it would be a little tougher for me to get the green color that I wanted. Now I'm going to start adding the darker shades of the green. I'm using the Perylene green now. Now I'm going to work on the sidewalk or the driveway here. And then while I'm at it, I'm going to put in some of the darker areas over here to make some shadowy sides. I'm trying to keep the focus of the painting on this house and not put too much focus on the neighboring houses. My clients did not want to focus or did not want to emphasize the neighbors as much. So part of the technique is trying to figure out how to de-emphasize the objects on the left and right. And part of that is to not have as much detail, but also try to make them a little bit out of focus by using some washes and keeping things kind of hazy. And some of it will also be keeping values lower on the left and right side as much as possible, so that this main house, which is the real subject of the painting, will stand out more. And so with the dark that I'm putting down, I can pretty much use it also to clarify some of the shapes that I have here, and this will help give some definition. For me, putting down darks is always one of the most fun parts. And up here, the shadow is slightly bluer, so I'm going to add a little bit more blue. And that might be a little bit too dark because I want to be able to see some of that side of the house, but what I'll do is kind of lift away a little bit of this so I can hint at some of the windows that are there. So you can see I'm just barely hinting at some of the shapes and the lines that are in that shadow. So the shadows, the dark areas will help us frame this main house, and I think that will be effective for emphasizing the house as the main subject here. Now I have this bright white area over here, which I don't want to remain white because that will unnecessarily draw focus to that area. So I'm going to start filling that in with some of the yellow ochre that I see, and maybe the light, a much lighter version of it over here, and then put in the roof line. And then that will finish giving some definition to this area without drawing too much focus to it. I'm going to go in with the burnt sienna to start emphasizing this gutter area. And I'll do the same up here. And just putting those colors down, you can see how it's already starting to help it to blend in more to the peripheral. Again, we don't want to draw too much attention to this area. And I'm probably just going to do this area right here with a little bit of a dirty brush just to fill it in so it's not white. And I'll do the same over here. I'm going to wet this whole area because I kind of want all of this to be a pretty even value, even though there's a gradient here. I'm going to try to treat all of this at once. So there's somewhat of a gradient from the lighter areas on at the top, at the roof line going down, it'll get darker. And I'm gonna add some burnt sienna to this back here. It's kind of darker. Gonna get progressively darker here, adding some burnt umber. And adding some cools here. And I need to remember to lift this area so that I can not lose the post here that I accidentally covered up. And part of the trick here of keeping these peripheral subjects more on the side and not draw too much attention to them is to make sure most of it's going to be soft and diffused so that we don't draw so much attention to it. And while it's wet, I can keep adding pigment to it, and that will help it to kind of blend together better. Lifting out an area here to kind of hint at the window. So now I'm going to start working on the lawn, and I'm going to start by putting a wash down of lighter yellowish green for these lighter passages. It'll be kind of just a base layer. And now that the lawn has dried just a little bit, it's still wet. I'm going to put down some darker strokes to show the shadows that are on the lawn, and I'm going to primarily use the perylene green, which is the much cooler green in my palette, and it's helpful to do this while it's still a little wet so that I can at least have some diffusion, and these edges won't be as harsh. They won't dry as harsh. So I'm just gonna let some bright areas of the grass remain bright. And you can see it actually dried a good amount, so my edges are not as diffused as I would like, but it's something I can work at, no problem. And you can deal with that by just taking a semi-moist brush and going along the edges here so that it gives it a chance to blend in a little bit. So I'm actually just lifting out some of the harder edged places. I'm using a large round brush because it helps me to get larger areas. And I don't want it to be like pinpoint accurate anyway. And I'm making sure that these dark lines of shadow are actually going diagonally, as it shows a little bit of movement and gives a little bit more interest rather than just flat, straight lines going across. It also gives a sense of the slope of the lawn. I'm just going to go down like that. And you can actually hint at the shape of the lawn using your brush strokes. And it's okay to have some harder edged strokes in here because it's not all the same. It's not all the same values or the same intensity throughout, because the grass kind of undulates. It goes up and down because of the surface. The ground is not completely flat. So yeah, just putting some additional touches here. I see some bushes here that I want to make pretty dark, and I'm leaving some of that yellowish green to outline it at the top, and smoothing out the edges here again because we don't want the eye to be drawn to it too much. So the lawn has dried a bit now, and I'm going to just keep refining the image. There's a few places where I want to either add some lines so that we can have a better sense of what the shape is. Like over here, this is a roof, but it's not really clear what that is. And then I'm gonna add a few more detailed lines. I'm not gonna do every line that's in the shingles, but enough to give some texture and to show us a little bit of shadow. And yeah, so let's keep going with this. So I just put some yellow ochre down there. It's a warm color, and it will help to show that the sunlight is on this. And I'm kind of blending it in with the dark shadow so it's not such a harsh line. All right, so I think I've sufficiently made this house recede into the background a little bit more. And I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna over here to accentuate that roof line where the gutter is. And while that's drying, and while I have some of the burnt sienna still available, I'm going to add a line, a detail on the gutter of this house. And I'm going to add a little bit of detail along this edge. These little touches are what will really sell the texture of a place. I want to be careful not to do too much of it because I'm liable to just like keep going, and then it'll feel too empty if I don't do the entire surface. So it's important to keep these relatively diffused. That's a little too much. So I'm going back in with a moist brush. Just trying to de-emphasize these a little bit. And you just have to do enough of these to establish a sort of pattern. Again, I don't want to do too much, otherwise I'm going to go down this path of doing all these lines, and I want to do just enough that you get a sense of where the little cracks and crevices are. And you want to vary the lengths of these lines. And I'm also just trying not to, excuse the pun, paint myself into a corner by doing too many of these. And as I go along, I'm also cognizant of how I might be adjusting values here and there. And it's important to keep in mind the relationship of values. So if I darken too much of one spot, I may have to go and darken another area. So I may just do a few more lines. Yeah, I think that's probably good enough. I'm just looking for other spots potentially to define with my dark paint here, since I have it on my brush. I'm just using the dark colors to give some shape where it stands to use some volume. I'm going to go back to this area here. It's dry enough where I can put in the shadow underneath that roof. Just hinting at it a bit. I'm going to soften that up a little bit so it doesn't stick out so much. There's a window up here. And it's just enough to hint at what's over there. And I see the other parts I want to take care of now are the foliage that's on the left side. The client wanted to have some visible foliage coming into the frame, which is basically in the very foreground. So I'm going to keep those pretty sharp. But again, certain edges will be sharp, but some should be blurry because they shouldn't be the focal point. They shouldn't be on the same plane of focus, same clarity as the house itself. But we'll see how that works. I'm going to darken some areas in this tree here. So making sure that you skew more towards the blue end of your color mixing really helps to show the shadowed areas effectively, because things in shadow are going to be much cooler. So now I'm going to work on the foliage up here. I'm going to just put down some greens. Some of this should be out of focus or basically diffused. So I will lay down some layers here and then come in with more saturated colors to emphasize a few of the leaves. And I don't want to be too precise here because, again, I don't want to draw too much interest to these areas. It's more about letting the foliage provide a frame for the subject matter. Got a few more finishing touches. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this is turning out. So yeah, I'm very close to being finished with this. I think there's some more greens I can add here. And I'm going to let it sit for a little bit and see if there's anything else I need to go back in and touch up. So after finishing the painting and sending a quick video to my clients, they came back with some feedback, and essentially they were asking if the shadows in the lower right corner could be less contrasty. They were very prominent. So I basically agreed to see what I could do about softening this area. Basically, I took my spray bottle and I sprayed down this area, being careful to shield the rest of the painting from the spray. I took paper towel, bunched it up real good, and basically dabbed it, pat it down, and this way it actually did help soften these dark areas on the lawn. So I think it worked out. You can see a before picture showing how sharp those dark areas were, and I think it was a good observation by my clients, and I think it will help to make this area stand out a little bit less and allow the viewer's eyes to really stay focused in the center part of the painting, which is really the whole point of this painting. So I received another request from the client to try to soften the contrasting area here on the lawn, and I successfully did that for this lower right corner as I showed you before, and now they've asked if I can soften it up a bit in the middle of the lawn as well. So I see their point, and I think it will turn out better actually with these notes. So we're going to try to do that right now, and I'm going to put a piece of paper here to kind of protect the area above that. And what I'm going to do is use a spray bottle and just give it a few spritzes here. And if I just let it sit on its own, it will actually soften up. The pigments will start to move around, but I do want to try to shape it a little bit by just patting it down. And this is a nice hack for softening up some hard edges. I myself personally like dramatic lighting, so that's probably why it tended towards this pretty high contrast look. Ultimately, we did decide on the photograph together, so it's not like this was a complete surprise, but probably after the image has been painted, you know, it's easier sometimes for people to look at it with fresh eyes and realize, oh, well, maybe I don't want such harsh shadows in the foreground. And that's perfectly valid. I see their point. So we can see that it's definitely softened up a bit. I may have to use a brush for some of these harder edges up here, like that. The reason why I avoided a brush to begin with is using a brush sometimes will just result in these streaks that may be more noticeable. So patting it with the paper towel is actually more effective and less prone to causing brush strokes and unwanted edges here. Some of this is subjective too, because you know there will be some hard edges. There should be some hard edges mixed in with less hard edges throughout, depending on the actual terrain. But I think this is looking better. It's looking softer, like it's a little bit more blended in. And this just goes to show how it's still possible with watercolor. You know, a lot of people say it's very unforgiving, and if you make a mistake or you put paint down, that you pretty much have to live with it. But it's not completely true. There's certain techniques that you can employ to quote unquote fix a painting after the fact. So there we have it. I think I've softened up the shadows on the lawn so it doesn't seem as dramatic, and we'll see how the client responds to this.